One of the first questions you might have this week is why we're covering Chapter 21, which comes at the end of the textbook, so early in the semester. And I want to start this sort of mini lecture this week by talking about that question, and then we'll talk about the substance of the chapter and some other issues related to it that aren't explicitly addressed in this chapter, but are important for understanding the issues that it raises. So first, why Chapter 21 now? The answer is that Chapter 21 covers what's known as public choice economics, which is applying the economic way of thinking to understanding the behavior of political actors. Why is that important? Well, I think it's important for a bunch of reasons, but mostly because so much of what we're going to talk about the rest of the semester as we get into the growth and macroeconomics portion of the course is about policy, is about how policy gets made, whether it's about economic growth in the long run or about macroeconomic policy in the shorter run. We're going to be talking about what politicians, what policymakers do. And we're going to be talking about how economic models offer explanations for what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing and so forth. And it's really easy, I think, to look at those economic models and say, okay, that's the answer, we should do that. What public choice economics lets us do is just say, wait a minute, maybe it's not that simple. And in particular, what I want to emphasize at the start here is that the ideas I'm going to talk about today and the ideas that are in this chapter are ideas that should permeate all of our thinking about growth and macroeconomics. One of the things I don't like about this textbook, I like a lot about it, but I don't like the fact that it leaves this to the end. And it seems to me this shouldn't be at the end, this should be at the start. Early on, so that we're always asking the questions that public choice economics raises as we work our way through the rest of the semester. So the reason for putting it up front and moving 21 so early is to get you to start thinking about these things now and to have them in your mind as we go through the growth and macro parts of the course. So with that, let me start with a story. The story goes something like this. There was once a king, and the king wanted to audition to have a new sort of court singer who would be his official singer at all the royal events. And so he sent his staff out across the kingdom, American Idol style, and went in search of the best singers that he could find. And eventually the king's staff narrowed it down to two, and the king said, bring them to the throne room, let me hear them sing. And so the two contestants, the two finalists, came to the throne room, and the first one sang, and when the first one was done, the king said, that is the worst singing I've ever heard. It's terrible, and immediately gave the job to the second singer. Now, what's wrong with this story? If we were in a real classroom or even in Zoom, I would hope I would see a bunch of hands go up at this point and say, wait a second, what's wrong with the story is the second singer might have been worse. As bad as the first one was, the second singer might have been worse. And how do we know if the second singer is worse or better without hearing the second singer sing? And that's exactly the problem here. That's exactly the right answer. And this little parable little story is a parable for how economists have talked about market failure and government failure. For many years in the 20th century, right, economists had these models of sort of perfect markets and perfect competition. If you've taken 201, you can think back to those models, right? And the idea was when actual markets didn't work out the way our perfect model said they were supposed to, we identified that as market failure. And we said, see, markets haven't worked. The classic example of this, you might have done this in 201, is something like pollution, where the social costs of pollution are greater than the private costs, and we get more pollution than is socially optimal. What's the solution to these supposed market failures? Well, the argument is we bring government in, and government comes in the case of pollution, it puts a tax on the polluter, redistributes the revenue from that tax to the people who were victimized by the pollution, and we've solved the problem that way. And we can draw that up on a blackboard, and it looks great. The problem is that in fact what policymakers and politicians and other political actors will do. Just because we draw it up on a blackboard doesn't mean that they're going to do it. What if government fails too, right? What if policy, what government intervention is like our second singer, right? We can't just say, oh, bring government and have them solve the problem because the market was less than perfect. That's exactly like awarding the singing job to the second singer without hearing him sing. We have to ask the question, how does government work, and will government actually do what we want it to do, what we say it should do? So once the possibility of government failure is raised, we're in a whole different set of issues here. Now we have to ask the question of what we call comparative institutional analysis. We have to begin to ask, how well the markets work, how well the governments work, which one works better, right? Neither one of them is going to be perfect, but which one works better? And that's the key insight, I think, of public choice economics, is to get us to realize that we can't just assume that when markets fail, the government policy we drop on the blackboard or on the whiteboard will solve the problem. We have to actually analyze how political processes work. And one of the ways we do that, or one of the sort of key factors in thinking through that comparative analysis, is we have to assume what we call behavioral symmetry. Part of the problem is that economists, at least implicitly, well, explicitly assume that in the market, people were largely self-interested, right? They engage in exchange to satisfy our wants, right? We were broadly, in some sense of the term, self-interested. But suddenly, when those same people got into the political process and began to develop policy or vote on things or whatever it might be, we forgot about that. They magically weren't concerned about their self-interest anymore. They were public-spirited, public-interested, and thus, if economists presented them with a model that said, here's what policy should do, the question of their own self-interest was never raised. It was, oh, well, of course, we'll do that. But as the public choice economists pointed out, right, this doesn't seem right? It's the same human beings. We have to make symmetrical assumptions about the behavior of people in both markets and politics. And this is one of the founders of public choice economics is James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in 1986, and certainly Buchanan's one of his key insights and sort of the sort of foundation for his work was this notion of behavioral symmetry. What happens if we begin to view politics as a process of exchange, like markets, among broadly self-interested people, like markets? How well does it work, right? How well do the institutions of politics turn self-interested exchange, or cause self-interested exchanges to benefit the public? To what degree are they positive sum as opposed to zero or negative sum? We know in the market, when we let people pursue their self-interest under good institutions, good things happen. And we're going to talk some more about that in this chapter and the next couple as we talk about institutions and growth. But that's the key question, right? People are people. They're going to behave the same way, whether it's in the marketplace or whether it's in the political arena. The question is, what will be the consequences, particularly the unintended consequences of their behavior? And one way to think about that is, how well do the institutions provide incentives and information to get people to make good decisions, and in particular, to learn from their mistakes? One of the things we know about markets is that when you make a mistake in the marketplace, prices and profits and loss provide you both an incentive and information that tell you you've made a mistake and give you reasons to correct it. How well does politics do that? If we assume the same thing about people and ask the same questions about both sides, we get a much more interesting analysis than simply assuming that the political process will do exactly what our economic models say that it should do. So that's one way of thinking about what is it when we say we want to do comparative institutional analysis. What exactly do we want to do? We want to compare how well different sets of institutions provide incentives and information to actors to enable them to learn from their mistakes and to do things that benefit others in important ways. So that's, I think, the fundamental insight of public choice theory. A couple of the other supplementary videos for this chapter talk about some particular applications of that theory, but that's the fundamental idea. And so why does this really matter? I mean, so what when we think about macro and growth policy, what is really happening here, right? One way to think about it is sort of the inverse of the question we've been asking, which is to say, why doesn't policy look like the models? That is, why do we see outcomes from economic policy and government intervention not work the way those models should? Isn't it the case that attempts at pollution abatement that follow that model, they don't work? Why is that, right? And part of the answer is that, again, we can think about public choice that way. One of the best examples of this in macroeconomics, and we'll talk a lot more about this later in the semester when we, again, get to thinking more in detail about policy, is the relationship between government budget deficits and macro policy. Without going into much depth and just sort of enough to make the point, economic theory says, of course, that we should, at least Keynesian economic theory says, that we should run deficits when we have recessions, right? Government should spend more than it takes in. It should spend more than it brings in tax revenue when we have recessions, okay, and that will, the idea mean that the government spending will make up for the lack of private sector spending. And when the economy is doing well, when it's out of recession and doing well, we should have budget surpluses. That is, revenue should be greater than spending, so we can have enough to pay off the deficits we ran when we were in recession. And the idea behind this is that over time the budget would balance. Some years would be in deficit during recession, some years would be in surplus when things were going well, and in the long run they would balance each other out. Well, suffice to say, the history of since World War II of the American economy, and pretty much every economy in the developed world, doesn't work that way. Staying with the United States, we've seen budget deficits in almost every year. A couple of exceptions, and some in the 90s, one in the late 60s, and a couple before that. But virtually every year we've seen a budget deficit. And those deficits have exploded, of course, in the last 10 years, particularly in the last few. And so the question is why? Right? Theory says we shouldn't have $26 trillion in debt. We should be balancing off the bad times with the good times. Why doesn't it work that way? It's not that the economy's been in recession virtually every year since World War II. So there has to be another explanation for why politicians aren't doing the thing that economists said they should do. And the answer, of course, is to go back to public choice theory. Think about the behavioral symmetry point. If we remind ourselves that politicians are no more or less self-interested than people in the market are, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, what would self-interested politicians do in the face of the ability to run budget deficits? And the answer there is they'll keep running deficits. Why is that? Well, if they spend, right, they can spend on programs and policies that benefit their constituents and get votes. If they raise taxes to cover that spending, that makes their constituents upset and they lose votes. So if you're a politician and you're broadly self-interested and you are a vote seeker, sort of analogous to the profit-seeking of the marketplace, if you're a vote-seeking politician, what are your incentives here? Your incentives are to spend, and keep taxes as low as possible. The result is year after year after year, budget deficits. And nobody wants to cut spending, right? Because everyone says, well, I don't want to cut spending that benefits my constituents, and the next guy says that, and the person after that says it, everyone says, I don't want to cut spending. Spending never gets cut. So the incentives of the institutions of the political arena are such that it leads to deficits. And notice, it leads to deficits even if politicians say they don't want deficits. As long as they want votes, they're going to end up doing things that lead to deficits. So if you want to view it as the unintended consequences of self-interested behavior within political institutions are problematic, right, are bad, in a way that the unintended consequences of self-interested behavior in the marketplace tend to be good under the right sets of institutions. And politics, again, lacks the incentive for people to do the right thing, and oftentimes lacks the information. Politicians just don't know what they need to know to be able to figure out exactly what to do and when to do it. So that's why this matters, right? When we say things like we have a recession, here's what macroeconomic theory says we should do about the recession, it might look good on paper, but we have to ask that question, will, in fact, real-world politicians actually do this? And if they won't, what will they do? And it's possible, King Singer, that what they will do will be worse than the problem they're trying to solve. Right? Again, markets are imperfect. Right? We might get times of slow growth and recession. Okay? The question is whether the policy interventions, as they will actually be practiced, will improve on that or make matters worse. I won't go into too much detail, but you can see the same thing at work and why we see so much special interest legislation. Okay. Again, same sort of thing. Politicians have an incentive to do things that get them votes, and making particular interests happy is one way to do that. We also have the phenomenon of what we call concentrated benefits and dispersed costs, where the people who benefit from government intervention have a much stronger incentive to lobby for it than the people who are harmed by it. One of the supplemental videos is Deanna Thomas talking about why is there about sugar and Coca-Cola, and you'll understand and high fructose corn syrup, and it's a great example of this phenomenon. So when you watch that video, keep that in mind. So the bottom line here is that what public choice economics tells us is that politics, like markets, is just another process of exchange through which people attempt to improve their well-being. The problem is whether the institutional arrangements of politics generate or cause that self-interest to generate good or poor unintended consequences. And that's the comparative question that we want to ask. We want to say, how well do markets do this? How well does politics do this? Neither one does it perfectly, but which one does it better? And secondly, we want to keep in mind that once we understand the imperfections of politics, we can't just assume that policy will be executed in the way we draw it up in our models and on the blackboard and in the textbook and so on. So anytime that you say things like, well, government should step in and do X because there's this problem in the marketplace or problem with the macroeconomy, to say government should do X is not the same thing as saying government will or is able or is likely to do X. And you can't sort of put that aside as a separate question. It has to be built in. The word economists would use is endogenized, right? Put right back into the story, into the model to say the very way we model policy has to take account of those questions. We can't just say, well, if perfect political actors would do X, oh, well, maybe they're not perfect. Why do the first, right? We want to, from the beginning, say, here's what we think policy should do, but we know, or at least have to account for the fact that politicians may not do what we as economists or what our economic models say we should do. One way to put that is this policy compatible with the incentives and institutions facing political actors? We have to ask that question every single time we adopt policy or we recommend policy, for whether it's economic growth or short-term macroeconomic stability, all of the things we're going to talk about for the rest of the semester. Every single time, the question to ask is this policy we're proposing compatible with the incentives facing political actors? And the related question, of course, is also who benefits, if you want your Latin for the day, cui bono. Right? Who benefits from this, right? And thinking through the self-interest of political actors is important here too. One last example of all of this, as I do this lecture, we're just at this sort of breaking point between the unemployment benefits related to COVID having run out and the need for a new set of a new presumed need for a policy to continue it or move forward. And two things. The original COVID Relief Act, $2 trillion worth, that wasn't all checks written to people who were unemployed. There was all kinds of other spending in there for all kinds of other things that had nothing to do with COVID and unemployment. And now the bill that's being proposed by the Republicans currently is less. It's only $1 trillion, but same problem, right? It has new FBI building, all this military stuff in it. Why? That's not what this is about, or supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about relief for people who have been thrown out of work by COVID. But nonetheless, the bill gets filled with all of, again, these special interests and particular things that people want to have in it. Why is that? Public choice helps us understand that. It's easy to want to say, well, why can't they just pass a bill that we say we're going to give people a certain amount of money per week, a certain number of weeks, or a certain number of people, do the math, figure out what the total is, divide it up, write the checks. Right? That seems like the sensible solution. Why doesn't that happen? Again, the incentives and institutional structures of politics aren't compatible with doing that. Once you start spending money, everybody, all the vote seekers want in on it to provide the things that they know will help them. So again, that's a good example of how we can use this kind of public choice way of thinking to ask these questions, right? But is this policy compatible with the incentives facing political actors, and who benefits from it? Who benefits from a new FBI building? Who benefits from all this military spending, right? Asking those questions is really important. So as we move on through the rest of the semester, please keep this in mind. The later chapters in the book don't talk about it because, again, this chapter comes at the end, which I think is a problem. So having put it up front for us, it's really important to me that you continue to think about this. And this is something, I think, a really good use we can make of the discussion forums this semester, the Zoom discussion forums, is if we want to talk about, right, what would public choice say about the things in this chapter? That would be a really good way to keep reminding ourselves of how important it is. So again, please do watch the supplementary videos here in this module, as they will expand on a bunch of things that I've talked about in this lecture.